Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Rational Wellness Podcasters, thank you so much for joining me again today. For those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a ratings and review. That way more people will be able to discover the Rational Wellness Podcast. And if you'd like to see a video version, please go to my YouTube page. And if you go to my website, drweitz.com, you can find a complete transcript and detailed show notes. Today, our topic is an integrative approach to mood disorders like depression and anxiety with Dr. Peter Bongiorno. Depression is a mood disorder characterized by a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 2013, 16.7% of adults filled one or more prescriptions for psychiatric drugs, with most being antidepressants. And this prevalence is higher among women than men. An estimated 3.2 million adolescents aged 12 to 17 in the U.S. had at least one major depressive episode, representing 13.3% of adolescents. Anxiety is characterized by feelings of worry, nervousness, or fear that are strong enough to interfere with one's daily activities. And anxiety is even more common than depression, with 19.1% of U.S. adults having experienced an anxiety disorder in the last year, and 31.1% having experienced an anxiety disorder sometime in their lives. And these numbers for rates of anxiety have been rising in the U.S. Depression and anxiety are typically treated within conventional medicine with medications like antidepressants such as Prozac, Zoloft, and Lexapro. And these are among the most commonly prescribed medications in the U.S. And the number of people taking these medications has been rising rapidly. Recent statistics show 64% increase in the number of people taking antidepressants in the last 15 years. 12.7% of the U.S. population took antidepressants in the last month, and older adults took them in even higher numbers. Most of these antidepressants were originally approved by the FDA for short-term usage, and there were only a few studies that lasted longer than a few years. But yet, many patients are being placed on these drugs indefinitely, and it's very difficult to get off these drugs. A large percentage of patients who take them report severe withdrawal symptoms when trying to wean themselves off, or are unable to wean themselves off. So one of the focuses of our conversation today will be whether these drugs are actually effectively treating the causes of depression and anxiety, and what alternative treatments might be available, taking a holistic or functional medicine approach, either as alternatives for patients who do not want to take these medications, or perhaps to make these medications more effective. Dr. Peter Bongiorno is a naturopathic doctor and acupuncturist, and he's the co-director of Inner Source Natural Health and Acupuncture, with offices in New York City and on Long Island. He was a researcher at the National Institutes of Health in the Department of Neuroimmunology, and then he went to Bastyr University to study naturopathic medicine and acupuncture. He's written a number of books, including Healing Depression in 2010 and Holistic Solutions for Anxiety Depression, as well as How Come They're Happy and I'm Not, and Put Anxiety Behind You, the Complete Drug-Free Program. Dr. Peter is a sought-after speaker, and he spoke at the A4M conference in Las Vegas in 2018, where I saw him speak. Dr. Bongiorno, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, gosh, it's my pleasure.
So what do you think rates of depression and anxiety are so prevalent today? And especially anxiety seems to be rising among teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that anxiety and depression rates are just soaring. And it's, it's really interesting because as you kind of alluded to with the statistics, we're using more and more of these drugs for depression and for anxiety every year. And yet more and more people are getting anxiety and depression every year. And if you look at, for example, depression, one of the things you worry about the most, of course, is suicide, right?
Right.
And suicide rates have soared. There's a few studies that look at rates from between 2007 and now, and we're seeing these incredible jumps, and even just the past few years. So despite the fact that all of these drugs are being used and more are coming out on the market, the endpoint, which we're most concerned about, is only becoming more and more of a problem. So
In fact, the side effect of some of these drugs is that they actually increase suicide rates, right?
Yeah, so now they're putting black box warnings on things like SSRIs, which are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are commonly used for depression and anxiety. But now they're showing that in younger people, they may actually increase suicide rates. So in fact, it started out with very young people, like adolescents teens and adolescents, and now they're even bringing it up to young adults that they're seeing this concern with. So, and it's not to say that medications don't have their place. Sometimes when someone is in a real urgent care situation and there's really no other choice, then sometimes a drug can be life-saving. So it's not that they're completely not useful and always a bad idea, but they're certainly being far overused, and they're not getting to the underlying problem. And for many people, they might kind of numb a symptom when they do work. So for example, depression, in mild to moderate depression, which is when SSRIs are used the most, they work about 30 to 35% of the time, which is maybe a hair more than a placebo would work. So, and even in those cases, at some point, it's usually within 2 to 5 years, those medications tend to not work as well anymore anyway. So at some point, you still have to say, okay, we have to figure out what's going on. And so even for people when they work in the case of depression, you still want to sit down with each person and say, well, what's the reason, things kind of went awry? So if an SSRI fixes serotonin and that helps, you still want to ask, well, why did the serotonin get out of balance to begin with? And these are the questions that aren't being asked. Instead, people are just being put on medication and sent on their way. And then once it stops working, it becomes a crisis.
And you wonder if this whole concept of these mood disorders actually being caused by neurotransmitter imbalances is really valid. If you think about the fact that we have drugs that increase serotonin, you're talking about SSRIs, then we have drugs that increase norepinephrine. Now we have drugs that increase dopamine. We have drugs that affect GABA, glutamate. We even have drugs that decrease serotonin and seem to be equally effective.
That's right.
So you just have to wonder, what do we really know about the complexity of brain chemistry? And it certainly doesn't seem to be as easy as just increasing serotonin production.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Yeah, there's and it's interesting because the drugs that seem to work the best, not great, but certainly the best, are what are called tricyclic antidepressants, which are the old ones.
Oh,
and they kind of just seem to basically raise everything. So it's kind of, just pull everything up and hopefully it'll help somebody feel better. But the problem with those drugs is that they do have a lot of side effects, which is why, they're considered first generation, not really used so much anymore. And like I said, in mild to moderate depression, which is the vast majority of use of these prescription drugs, it only works maybe 30-35% of the time tops. Anxiety, on the other hand, benzodiazepines, drugs like Xanax and Ativan, they do work. When somebody takes one of those, they get calmer. But the problem with those drugs is you can't keep taking them. You get addicted to them. They stop working. You need more and more. And I can't tell you all the patients I see on the same trajectory. They're young. They get anxious. They get put on Ativan. The Ativan doesn't work. They get put on Xanax. Now they get withdrawal at night. They have trouble sleeping, so they get put on Klonopin. And then the Klonopin stops working, so they get put on Tramadol or something even stronger, Trazodone. Right. And and it's just we keep upping the ante, and these get stronger and stronger to the point where people, they can't get off them, but they're not working anymore either. And I can't tell you how many patients I've seen in that situation as well. And and it's just a testament to the fact that the body is not being treated to heal. It's just being treated for symptoms.
Right.
And that doesn't work.
Right. So let's get into some of the natural approaches. What role does diet play in depression and anxiety? And what's the best type of diet to control these?
So, the first thing I want to say is that, there's a lot of factors that play a role, and you just touched on a major one. So diet, if people are sleeping, whether they're exercising or not, certainly what's going on with their thoughts play a role, environmental toxicities, inflammation in the body, digestion, hormonal balance, nutrient deficiencies. So, when I look at a patient, I try to assess all of these different things at the same time and figure out for them, what are the factors that are contributing to what we're calling anxiety or what we're calling depression. So diet is clearly one of them. Our digestive tract is such an important place in terms of making the neurotransmitters. So if neurotransmitters are off, we really want to start thinking about the digestive tract. And, what we eat and what we put in our mouth, of course, is going to play a huge role in how well that digestive tract functions. So to answer your question, if I don't know a patient and someone asks me, well, what is the best diet? I would start with something, probably like a Mediterranean style diet. Mediterranean style diets are shown to be very beneficial to help raise GABA, which is the calming neurotransmitter. It helps lower inflammation. And we know that inflammation that goes to the brain can play a really strong role in all kinds of mood disorders. The Mediterranean diet really provides a lot of nutrients, a lot of good fiber for the microbiota in our body, which is clearly an important part of how we can balance neurotransmitters in our brain. So without knowing a person, if I had to pick a diet and didn't understand their sensitivities, I'd probably start with some version of the Mediterranean style diet.
Good. And what are some of the dietary factors that play a role here? I know in your book you talk about the importance of balancing blood sugar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so blood sugar is very vital because what I find is a lot of people who have both anxiety and depression, their blood sugar tends to bounce around a lot, or sometimes their insulin, which is the hormone that takes the sugar out of the blood and puts it into the cells, can get very high for some people, and that can also drive a lot of inflammation. So eating in a balanced way can be very useful. Now, everybody's different, so of course one size doesn't fit all, but usually I find if patients are very susceptible to mood changes when they don't eat, then the first step is really to make sure you're eating, throughout the day, at least 3 good meals, and definitely a good breakfast. I tell a lot of patients, you eat like a king for breakfast, a queen for lunch, and a pauper for dinner. And it does work, because I find when people eat a good breakfast, and I know right now with intermittent fasting, sometimes it's become desirable to not eat and have a breakfast later so that you lessen your hours.
Very popular, especially in holistic functional medicine circles, that we skip breakfast so we have a longer period of time between dinner the night before and lunch without eating.
Yeah, and that could be fine for some people therapeutically if they want to lose weight. But I always like to check in, because if they have mood issues, and especially if they have mood issues associated with not eating, then we might want to modify that for them. So again, everybody is different, and there's no one size fits all, and that might be great for some people and not so good for other people. But I find for mood, it's really helpful to have a good breakfast, to have a good lunch, and have a smaller dinner, and make those meals very, healthy, protein-based, whole foods, good healthy fats, and also some healthy carbs. You know, if you look at the diets really where people live the longest in the blue zones, they don't really get rid of all the carbs. They tend to eat, you know, good whole grains, beans, legumes, and things like that. And I find for my patients with mood, getting some of those carbs are really helpful to even keep the serotonin levels up. So, yeah, so everybody's different, but I think for mood, that's a good general rule.
Yeah, no, I think it's important that you're emphasizing the benefits of carbohydrates because especially in the last 5-10 years, carbs have kind of been demonized. And as some of these low carb diets have become more and more popular, like the paleo diet and the ketogenic diet, people are really seeing carbs as just completely evil. And I think we need to rethink that and realize that carbohydrates can play an important role, especially healthy carbs, lower glycemic ones that have a lot of nutrients and fiber and can be part of a healthy diet.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I had when I was a student over 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to spend time with Dr. Atkins at his center in New York City.
Oh, okay.
And you know,
low carb himself.
Yeah, I mean, the guy who really figured out that we're not that not eating fat and eating all of these bagels was a bad idea, right? So, I mean, nobody was talking about it. And I tell you, he was a very nice man. And the thing that I learned in his clinic is that, you know, therapeutically using very low carb can be really helpful and get people out of crises when there's a lot of inflammation, when there's heart disease, you know, things like that. But for the long term, it's not always a good idea. And I think even Dr. Atkins himself, you know, started people on a pretty strict diet and then eventually put them on a more modified diet.
That's not information that you hear a lot.
Yeah. So no, you hear about, you know, eating a lot of bacon and stuff, but I don't think that's what it was really about there.
Right.
So that's, you know, so and I think that's interesting. So, you know, all of these tools can be used therapeutically for the right person. But we really have to say, you know, as a practitioner, you know, do I want everyone not eating breakfast? You know, maybe some people that works, some people that's a disaster, you know, so we really have to tailor it.
You know, I've been in the healthcare field for 30 years. And when I first got into it, the big thing was everybody's fat because they skip breakfast. They don't have time,
right.
You know, and they rush off to work. And, you know, one of the big keys was you have to eat within a first hour of eating. And you have to have small meals or snacks. And now, you know, skipping breakfast, which was the bad thing, is now supposedly the good thing. So it's funny how these things go in cycles.
Yeah. You know, as info comes out, the pendulum kind of keeps swinging. And the truth is, it's all can be useful and it's all could be not appropriate. So it all depends on the patient. Everyone is different.
Yeah.
So, and that's really what's, you know, in a sense, I think what's fun about our job, right? We get to sit with a person. It's really an honor, spend a lot of time with each patient, learn about their life and their history, and then, you know, based on our knowledge, like help them figure out what really works for them.
Exactly.
And that's what's exciting to me about the job.
That's great. So we have all these different complicated factors, and you just touched on a bunch of them. So one of the ways to sort this out, besides taking a detailed history, is to do some lab testing. So what do you think are some of the most beneficial lab tests to help sort out patients with anxiety and mood disorders?
Yeah, well, with blood work, I definitely like to do a good cholesterol panel. You believe it or not, just to find out, to make sure it's not too low. Because cholesterol is the major molecule your body uses to make your other steroid hormones, you know, and so sometimes I worry it's too low. I know regular docs worry about it's too high. In fact, HDL levels, when they're low, that's actually considered a marker of depression. So you want to have good lipid levels.
We've been having a great discussion, but I'd like to take a minute to tell you about the sponsor for this episode. I'm thrilled that we are being sponsored for this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast by Integrative Therapeutics, which is one of the few lines of professional products that I use in my office. Integrative Therapeutics is a top-tier manufacturer of clinician-designed, cutting-edge nutritional products with therapeutic dosages of scientifically proven ingredients to help patients prevent chronic diseases and feel better naturally. Integrative Therapeutics is also the founding sponsor of TAP Integrative, a dynamic resource for practitioners to learn with and from leading experts and fellow clinicians. I am a subscriber, and if you include the discount code Weitz, WEITZ, you'll be able to subscribe for only $99 instead of $149 for the year. And now, back to our discussion. So what level of HDL is considered a marker for depression?
Under 35. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the lab test, but around there, around under 35.
Interesting,
so,
yeah.
And then
it's interesting because today you hear the latest drug, the PCSK9 inhibitors, which when combined with the statin, we can get your LDL below 40,
low. Right.
Exactly. And there's problems with getting your LDL level too low.
Yeah, what are we doing to the brain, right?
Right.
It's just not a great scenario for the brain.
Is there like a level of LDL or total cholesterol that you like to keep the body from getting too low on? Like, is there a cutoff?
I like to see it, the total cholesterol, at least around 180.
Okay.
I think is a good place to be, and maybe LDLs, around 90.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe 100. It just really depends, because we've been lowering them, and I'm not sure we're seeing the benefit of that.
Right.
But we are seeing the detriment to the brain, and
Yes.
to cognition and cognitive function. So it's, I think there's still a lot to be learned there. So I'm still open. But
it probably plays a role in the rise in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
That's what it seems to be. So, so it's...
Okay, so besides lipids, what other...
a good iron panel and iron storage, of course, vitamin D. Then I like to look at thyroid, a full thyroid profile. Not that thyroid is perfect, in terms of lab testing, but I think it's good to see where it is in terms of labs and then correlate it with how people are feeling clinically. Certainly look at things like red blood cell magnesium, carnitine is another amino acid that I like to look at, B12 certainly. And then I like to do a full hormonal panel. I like to look at the 5.4 or 5-point cortisol test, see how people's stress hormones are doing throughout the day and see what their circadian rhythm looks like. Looking at, especially for women, looking at the estrogen levels, but even in men, seeing what the estrogen level is important too, because that's important for serotonin and serotonin receptors. Progesterone in women as well is really important for the calming GABA neurotransmitter. Testosterone for both men and women can be very important for the brain. Melatonin levels are useful, especially when there's sleep issues, to see what's going on there. So pretty full profile. And then depending on the patient, there could be other things they might want to look at, like histamine levels, mitochondrial function, mold toxicity. So everyone's history is a little different, and then that might give me clues. Unfortunately, there's so many tests you can do. You can't run them all on everybody.
Right.
So you kind of need to listen to the patient, listen to the history, and then start looking down those roads first.
How do you assess mitochondrial function?
You can start with things like lactic acid, which is, an easy test, pyruvic acid, which you can do with blood work. Certainly looking at CoQ10 levels. CoQ10 levels, believe it or not, if they're low, that can suggest mitochondrial issues, or if they're too high. Because if a patient's not taking CoQ10, but their levels are high, that usually means the mitochondria are in some sort of distress. And
interesting.
So things like that. And then now there's more specific mitochondrial profiles and genetic profiles that look at mitochondria as well. So, and I'm starting to learn more about those too, which is pretty exciting stuff.
Right. There's that mito swab test that's available now.
Have you used that test?
I haven't yet, but I interviewed the doctor who came up with it. Yeah, Dr. Gannon.
That's terrific. Yeah, so things like that I think are really fascinating. And, for a lot of patients who I see, especially when they have like a lot of sensitivity to noise and light, as well as being very fatigued, looking at mitochondrial function, I think is a really great idea.
Yeah, good. So you mentioned sleep. How important is getting good quality sleep for?
Yeah, so if anyone's ever looked at any of my books, sleep is the first chapter. So if that tells you how important I think it is, sleep is, if people aren't sleeping, it's very, very hard to get them to feel better. So sleep is absolutely imperative. And if, the two things that I look at for patients is if they're not sleeping and if they're not pooping every day, that has to be worked on first, no matter what they're coming in for. Because
Right.
I find it's really hard to fix anything if those things aren't happening. So sleep is really, it's where our brain detoxes and where it de-inflames and fixes things. It's where our mitochondria fix themselves and rebuild. So it's critical.
Do you use devices to help assess sleep?
You mean like wrist devices and things?
Yeah, yep.
I there are a few different ones. I haven't found anything that has been especially useful yet. I don't think they're quite there yet. I mean, it's interesting, but to tell you the truth, usually just by giving getting a good story from the patient, usually I can figure out what's happening with the sleep.
Yeah, check out the Aura Ring.
The Aura Ring? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll give that a try.
So does it matter what time we go to sleep?
I think it does. Yeah, I mean, in Chinese medicine, they'll say an hour before midnight is worth 2 after midnight. And, our melatonin gets peak release somewhere between probably 8:30 and 10:30. And if we go to bed too far after that, we start to lose the beneficial effects of melatonin to get into a deep sleep earlier. And so we end up staying in a more surface sleep that lasts the whole night. And even if we're sleeping, the sleep isn't going to be deep. So getting to bed earlier is definitely advantageous because we'll get into a deeper sleep.
Yeah. So this refers to like our natural circadian rhythm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the body secretes the melatonin when light comes down.
Yeah, our eyes recognize, when it's evening and when it's nighttime, and that starts that whole process of melatonin. And melatonin really is a master hormone that tells our body it's time to go to sleep. And then once it does that, then it starts all those processes I mentioned before about detoxing and getting rid of inflammation and fixing the brain and all that. And, it's one of the reasons why these computers that we're on and all this blue light and TV watching and games, I had a patient I was working with yesterday who had he was in his early 20s, had pretty significant depression. It was the first time I had seen him. And, and for the last couple of years, he's up every night just playing games, till late. And of course, his sleep is completely disrupted. And that seemed to predate a lot of this mood. And I know it sounds simple, but that routine has got to get changed. And it's hard because, those games, they raise our dopamine and they raise our norepinephrine, and we kind of get addicted to them. And so between the addiction of those neurochemicals and then and the excitement of the game and then the changes our circadian rhythm, then we get into these patterns and then we wonder why we don't feel good.
Right.
So it's very disruptive.
So do you recommend blue light blocking glasses or using red light bulbs or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, with the patient I spoke about yesterday, that's one of the things we talked about is looking into blue light glasses because, when people are in a certain pattern, it's usually hard just to ask them to completely stop something. They're not ready. And, frankly, they're addicted to it. So we do it in steps, right? So something like maybe lessening the amount of time using blue light glasses is a good place to start. If possible, I'd like to get people to shut all the screens and blue lights an hour before bed. And if they want to read, they could read by an orange light or an orange red light, just enough light so that they could see, but not a color in a spectrum that'll suppress our natural melatonin.
Right. Let's see. In your book, you talk about therapeutic benefit of being in nature, like taking a hike.
Yeah. So the Japanese have a term for it. It's called shirin-yoku, and what they've recognized through studies from Japan and elsewhere is that the forest and nature emits these molecules they call phytonicids, and we actually breathe them in. They get into our bloodstream and they interact with our immune system and help our immune system work better, and interact with our nervous system and balance our neurotransmitters. So there's clear benefits, from a research and scientific standpoint of getting into nature. And, we all know that it just makes us feel good. There's no question about it, but there's real reason for it. I know Dr. Sinatra, I don't know if you've talked to him at all. He's a big proponent now of grounding, of,
Yes.
taking your shoes and your socks off, going to the sea, putting your feet in the sand.
Yep. One of the doctors in my office, Dr. Howard Elkin, he worked with him on that grounding study.
Yeah, I love it. It's great stuff. And, so it's getting into nature and just changing your whole electromagnetic field, and getting together with the earth. And it's just, our bodies respond very positively.
What about the role of exercise for depression and anxiety?
Yeah, so exercise alone has been proven to be as effective as any of the medications, right, by itself. So we know the medications for depression don't work so great, and for anxiety, they do work well, and so does exercise. Exercise is just, it's an interesting thing. As I'm learning more about depression, I'm learning how there's something, that mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin,
right.
About that?
Yep.
So there's a molecule in our body, this mTOR, that shuffles between building us up and breaking us down. And we need this balance of both. And exercise has really been shown to create that balance for that. And it helps us clean out when we need to clean out, and then build back up when we need to build up. And that has very beneficial effects on the nervous system. So for anxiety and depression, exercise is just such a key, especially in the way it burns our stress hormones, because let's say you're anxious, right? In the wild, if we were anxious, I'd feel my heart beating and I'd get very stressed and upset, and I'd see a bear behind me, and that would be the reason why I'd feel that way. And I'd run, I'd burn off those stress hormones, burn off that norepinephrine, get away from it, and then feel calm. Well, in today's society, we have those feelings and we get very stressed and anxious, but we're not burning it off. We're not doing anything to release it. And so it does build up in our body, and then it comes out as panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And in most cases, in my opinion, depression is really just anxiety and overwhelm that gets to the point where our body can't take it anymore. And so we start to almost decompensate for that or that overwhelm, and then we kind of get depressed. So anxiety and depression are almost like two sides of the same coin in most cases. And exercise is just a brilliant way to help remedy that.
Yeah, I think exercise is overlooked as a solution for so many problems. Everybody's into fasting these days, and one of the benefits is something called autophagy, which is where you break down your cells to rebuild yourself. And exercise is the original stimulator of autophagy, and you don't necessarily have to starve yourself.
Yeah, no. And the only thing I would say for my patients is if you're not getting enough sleep, don't trade sleep for exercise. So make sure you're sleeping first, and then get up and go exercise.
Right. What type of exercise? Do you think it matters?
From the studies I've read, all exercise is good. So certainly up to what a person can do. I generally recommend doing something you enjoy, because if you do something you enjoy, you'll continue to do it. What seems to be the most beneficial is actually having a mix where people are doing strength training and are doing some kind of cardiovascular. And in the mitochondrial studies I've seen, to build optimal mitochondrial function, doing both seems to be optimal.
Good.
Yep.
We were talking about testing. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the urinary neurotransmitter test to get a sense of what's happening with neurotransmitters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think tests all have their value and have their limits, but I do think looking at neurotransmitter testing through urine can be very, very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And then what about the role of the gut and the microbiome in mood disorders?
Yeah, so so what we're learning now, and every day I see new papers on the microbiome and the microbiota, right? So those little bacteria in our digestive tract we're finding plays such an important role in keeping the environment of our digestion proper, and that environment is really key to how sending signals to our brain that helps our brain create the right neurotransmitter balance. And also that environment in our gut also plays a really strong role in how inflammation happens in our body or doesn't happen. So as we were saying before, the foods we eat are certainly the first key towards that. But then, there's other things that we can do as well. There's specific foods that help raise the microbiome in different ways. And then there's certain fibers specifically that can help that process. I think there's so much that we still have to learn about it. But, the way I think about it is the microbiome, the microbiota in there, it's like this garden. And when you have a garden that has certain plants that are too many and other plants that aren't enough, then it creates a lot of imbalance and it's not a very productive garden. But when you have a very balanced garden with all different plants and species, that's usually when you get the most productive use out of it.
Yeah, there are supplements on the market like probiotics that claim to specifically improve mood.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Do you think it's a little early for those?
I think a lot more studies have to be done. I mean, I think the most compelling studies are there's some small clinical studies that are showing things like lactobacillus and bifidus can increase GABA levels in the brain. And even though those studies aren't large, there's a number of them now that are pointing in the same direction. So I think, using basic keystones like that seem to make sense.
Okay.
And now there's some other studies coming out with a few other strains, which I think still need to be replicated. But, I'm very, very interested, and it certainly does make sense. One thing we do know, though, is that the strains, a lot of the strains of interest are not, we're not actually capable of making into a supplement, at least at this point. So my general tact is to give patients the probiotics that we know can be helpful, that are basic keystone strains, and then make sure we're filling in with all the proper fibers and vegetable matter and fermented foods that can help add all those other and help our body make all those other strains that we probably can't supplement on their own.
Right. So outside of probiotics, let's go over some of the most beneficial nutritional supplements for mood disorders.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the basics, having a patient take a multiple vitamin, a good B complex, with a methylfolate is a great idea. And then certainly a fish oil, as well as the probiotics. So those to me are the basics probably for most patients to at least get started with it. And then after
fish oil has quite a bit of studies showing benefits for brain health as well as for mood disorders.
Yeah, in fact, the newest studies right now, coming out of the psychiatric journals, are showing that in patients who are treatment resistant, meaning that they're on a drug, but the drug isn't working, when you give them fish oil, then the drug seems to start working, which makes me think, well, maybe if you just gave them the fish oil, even without the drug, you probably get them feeling better too.
Right.
so I'm not sure. Anyway.
So what about the best? What's the most effective dosage for fish oil? And also, do you think it matters as far as I keep seeing studies showing, well, EPA is really better. No, DHA is better.
Yeah.
Do you think we know if it's better to have just a balanced EPA DHA, or if it's better to have more of a concentrated EPA or DHA?
Yeah, well, I think, it's a good question. I think the studies are fairly clear that EPA levels of around 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams are a good idea, with the associated DHA that would normally come with that in a regular fish oil. So, so maybe like 1,000 milligrams of EPA, around 300 milligrams of DHA. So I usually shoot for that ratio, and then depending on the patient, starting with either 1,000 milligrams or 2,000 milligrams of the EPA. It seems pretty clear to me that for anxiety and depression, looking at those levels of EPA seem to be the best. I know in children, sometimes giving higher levels of DHA can be useful for certain cognitive reasons and attention deficit. And so for those specifics, sometimes I think a higher DHA might have some benefit. But I think in general, for anxiety and depression, looking for those higher EPA levels, which, frankly, are what comes naturally in fish oil, seems to be the way to go.
And can you get those levels of EPA and DHA from vegetarian sources?
I find it's pretty difficult to do so. It's not that easy.
Right.
So my strong preference, when possible, is to use fish oil. If I have a patient, for ethical reasons or other reasons, religious reasons, or for allergies, they can't take fish oil, then we'll use other vegan oils and try to make up the difference. And like I'll give patients things like ahi oil, which has a reasonable amount of EPA for a vegetarian source.
What's it called?
Ahi flower.
Never heard of that one.
AHI flower oil.
Okay.
And so there are a few vegan and vegetarian versions that are out there that are a little higher because, a lot of people are cognizant that they need to get those essential fats.
Right.
Unfortunately, and I discuss this in my books, a lot of patients who have mood disorder, they're not very good at converting the vegan oils into the EPA.
Right.
So because they have the delta desaturase enzyme genetically maybe isn't working as well. And so for those patients, unfortunately, it's really important to try to get that EPA in directly if possible.
You mentioned B vitamins. You monitor some of those genes like the MTHFR and the COMT and some of the others. And
I do. Yeah, I mean, for a lot of patients, I do run the genetics to SNPs to take a look at that. Again, I think a lot of that is in its infancy, and I think to look at one gene SNP and say, oh, okay, you need this vitamin, and to look at another, I think it's very premature because there's so many gene interactions that we don't understand.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful. So in other words, if you see a patient who has a SNP of the COMT and a SNP of the DRD and a SNP of the tryptophan hydroxylase enzyme, and you see through testing like all their neurotransmitters are low and they're depressed, then it starts to add up. You think to yourself, okay, the genes show that they're probably not keeping them up, and certainly their testing shows it's low and clinically they're low. Then we know we have to work on that. So I like using it to to just basically inform.
Right.
So
part of the clinical picture, but don't place too much importance on just any one particular gene.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I've learned in this job is not to be religious about anything I've learned, because as soon as I get a little religious and think, oh, this is what people need, then it turns out not to be correct. So,
right.
I find you have to always be flexible and look at the patient first, and then look at all this testing as part of information to help make the best choices.
Yeah. What about other fatty?
About genetics, I think in the future it's going to be more and more useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. What about other fatty acids like GLA?
Yeah, so GLA, GLA actually has been shown to be very useful in alcoholism to help patients. A lot of people who are alcoholics. One of the reasons why they drink alcohol is because it artificially raises prostaglandins, these feel-good molecules as well in our body and in our brain. And what's been shown is that when we take things like GLA and certain oils in that realm, that we can actually help ourselves make those natural prostaglandins. And I've seen patients, with alcoholic tendencies and things like that do really well with those oils. They're also very good for hormonal balancing, like a primrose oil. So when you see women who have mood issues and they also have menstrual cycle disorders and things like that, I like using those. So yeah, they're definitely helpful.
What about vitamin D?
Vitamin D, right? It's the sunshine vitamin. It's the sunshine, right? I remember Alan Gaby. You know Alan Gaby?
Yeah.
He used to give us, he used to tell us that John Denver said sunshine on my shoulder made him happy. That was like the best study on vitamin D there was. So, yeah, I mean, vitamin D it's a neurosteroid. It's important for so many factors in our brain and in our body. And I think by itself, it doesn't cure depression if it's low and you bring it up, or anxiety. But I think it is a major factor that, needs to be looked at. I remember when I was in school 23 years ago in naturopathic school, they talked a lot about vitamin D. And when I got out to New York, nobody was running vitamin D, 16, 17 years ago. And I was just so amazed after all the things I learned about how wonderful it is. And now it's nice to see that people are running it, and that it's a common thing to look at now, even in conventional medicine.
Right. Absolutely. What about some of the most important minerals like zinc and magnesium?
Yeah, so magnesium, is, I think, a must for most people with anxiety. It plays a role in helping relax the muscles. It plays a role in helping the brain form GABA. I mean, there's just so many pleiotropic effects all over the body with magnesium. And I typically use magnesium glycinate. It's a very calming form. Sometimes I'll use magnesium threonate, which does seem to have an even more calming effect. I know when I take it, it's very, very relaxing, the magnesium threonate. So I'll use that with some patients, especially if they're really anxious.
And what dosage of magnesium do you like?
Usually, depending on the patient, I'll usually start with like 250 milligrams, maybe in the evening before bed, especially if there's sleeping issues. I am careful, though. Sometimes magnesium could cause loose stools, and different forms of magnesium might be better for that than others. But other than that, magnesium is usually a really nice choice for patients for both anxiety and depression. It's good for blood sugar balance, so it's a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I think the glycinate has less bowel issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was the other? Oh, zinc. Right.
Oh, yeah. What about some of the other minerals? Yeah.
Yeah. So zinc, zinc is such an important cofactor in so many places. Zinc is really important for the digestive system as well. I do like to look at that zinc to copper ratio, and I do find with most patients with mood issues, you'll see a very low zinc to copper, and sometimes you'll even see patients with high copper. And high copper can be a problem in terms of estrogen balance, and that can throw off serotonin as well. So, and zinc itself is a cofactor for making the neurotransmitters too. So for all those reasons, I like to check zinc, and when it's low or low normal, I typically will supplement with zinc. And I don't supplement too high, usually just 15 to 30 milligrams. I'm not a big fan of overdosing.
What is the zinc to copper ratio you like to see?
Oh, I mean, at least 1-to-1, and preferably zinc a little bit higher.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And what if the copper is too high? Do you ever use things like molybdenum or other things to lower the copper?
Yeah, well, usually I'll start with zinc.
Right.
And then if that doesn't work, then bring in things like molybdenum or just a good minerals formula, obviously without copper.
Right. What about lithium orotate?
Yeah, so lithium is one of my favorites for anxiety. It seems to be quite safe, and it's not, just for everyone listening. It's when we talk about lithium, we're talking about lithium, like lithium orotate, which is a mineral, which is used in very, very low doses, maybe 5 to 20 milligrams in adults.
And you're saying which is different than the prescription lithium.
Right. So prescription lithium is lithium carbamate, which is a much, much, much higher dose of lithium, maybe 900,000 milligrams plus carbamate, which is a separate drug on its own. And but lithium orotate is, has been used for a long time. It's quite safe. It's even safe in children. What they saw many years ago in the early part of the 19th century is that places that had high levels of lithium in the water,
there's like a crackling coming from your microphone somehow.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that any better now?
I think it's better if you hold it. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have been moving it around there. Thank you. And so what they noticed is that areas in the United States and even around the world that had higher levels of lithium typically had. No, still doing it?
Yeah.
Let me see if I can adjust it. I don't hear it from here. So
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we'll keep going.
Any better?
Yeah, right now I don't hear it. So
Okay.
okay.
I'll stay still. So lithium was, in places where
You
lithium
need
levels
some lithium, Peter.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, well, that's why I play the drums. It helps me get out some of that.
Oh, okay.
So lithium is just one of those things that in higher levels seem to lower, there's less rates of suicide. People are generally happier, less anxiety, less depression. In fact, 7-Up, the beverage, was originally lithiated water.
Really?
Yeah. So, and then when when they decided to take the cocaine out of Coca-Cola, they also took lithium. They said, okay, we're not putting anything in these beverages anymore. We don't know what this stuff is. And they took it out. But actually, lithiated water was around for a long time as something to just help people generally feel happier.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, sometimes for the young children, I'll have parents soak thyme, the herb thyme, which has high levels of lithium in it, and you can soak it in olive oil for like a month or so, and then you could spoon out, like maybe a teaspoon and put it on food once a day, and you'll get a couple of micrograms of lithium out of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Is there any downside to using lithium orotate?
In those levels, it doesn't seem to be.
Okay.
I know early on I had always was interested in checking like kidney function and thyroid, just, because we know the drug can cause problems with those. But
Right.
lithium orotate, those levels, I haven't seen anything in the literature that suggests a problem, and I certainly haven't seen it in patients.
Cool. What about use of amino acids as precursors for neurotransmitters?
Yeah, so amino acids, to me, thinking about using amino acids is similar to thinking about using drugs, right? Because we use drugs to stop the breakdown of a lot of those neurotransmitters, and we want to use amino acids to more naturally kind of bring up the levels of the neurotransmitters, which makes sense. If you give the body the precursor, it'll help to make its own. And I think that makes sense to me. And I think it's safer, and more gentle on the body than drugs. Certainly not as strong as drugs are. But I think, if you're using it in combination with all the therapies we just talked about, it can be very, very supportive. Like I find tryptophan is like if I have a patient who did well on an SSRI, but for some reason they don't want to stay on it or they're having side effects, transitioning to tryptophan can be really, really helpful. So instead of just taking everything away from them and removing the drug, you can bring in the tryptophan and kind of slowly lower the drug and raise the tryptophan. And if we get all the basics right, the sleep, the diet, the exercise, it'll work.
And use tryptophan or 5-HTP?
It depends. Theoretically, 5-HTP should be better, because it's closer to already in the pathway to serotonin. But I do find a lot of patients seem, for whatever reason, to do well with tryptophan. So I tend to use maybe equal amounts. Okay. And at night, if people have sleeping issues, I tend towards more of the tryptophan. And I can't explain why that's better. I know there's some studies that suggest if there's a lot of inflammation in the body, you might be better off using 5-HTP because the certain pathways, one pathway called the chironine pathway, suggests that if you use tryptophan, it could actually create more inflammation. But I have to say, clinically, I find tryptophan generally seems to work better. So but I'm open to either.
What about some of the other neurotransmitters? Any of them you find particularly helpful? I mean, other amino acids. Yeah.
Yeah, I like using tyrosine. Sometimes I created a formula that uses tyrosine in combination with mucuna. And I find that can be really useful for people, let's say you have a patient who did really well on Wellbutrin, and right. Dopamine's low, their genetics show they're probably low, the neurotransmitter tests show they are low. Using things like tyrosine and mucuna can be very helpful for that purpose.
What about GABA?
And GABA, I find for some people it works well, for other people it doesn't. Theoretically, I've read if you have a leaky gut, then GABA can work well because it gets to the brain. You need both a leaky gut and a leaky brain barrier.
Right.
Both of those, it works.
That's what Dr. Krasnian says, right?
Yeah. So it's but GABA I think can be very helpful. A lot of times I'll use GABA and lithium orotate together. or sometimes I'll even use that with GABA with theanine. Seem to work really well together.
Yeah. What about some of the herbs like St. John's wort?
Yeah, so St. John's wort's the most studied herb of all time, and there's very solid evidence. It's interesting. I just read an article in the Washington Post, which I wrote a letter to the editor about, and basically it was this woman who's a nutritionist who was basically saying how supplements don't work, and one of the experts that she quoted was saying how St. John's wort really has no studies suggesting it works. And I read that and I was just amazed. I'm like, well, apparently that person isn't looking at PubMed at all.
Right.
I mean, there are scores of analyses and scores of meta-analysis, and then there's a bunch of meta-analysis of the meta-analysis, all showing that St. John's wort head-to-head to the SSRIs, the most commonly used antidepressants, work just as well in mild to moderate depression with much less side effects. So it's amazing to me that a major paper like that could have this kind of information. It just shows you the bias that these people have going in.
Yes.
And and again, if you want to challenge me on that, you could say, well, you just told me the drugs themselves don't work much better than placebo, right? So and that's true. So what I'm saying is St. John's wort, I think, has an effective rate at least as well as the drugs, but it doesn't mean it's the whole story. And that's why I don't want people to get the idea of, oh, I don't feel well, I have anxiety, I have depression, I'm just going to take St. John's wort and go along my way. No, we still need to work on sleep and exercise and our thoughts and going to therapy and the right foods. And then with St. John's wort, I think it's a slam dunk, it works great.
Right. And you're really bringing up the importance of employing the entire functional medicine model and not thinking you can reduce it to just simply taking a particular supplement. And if all you do is take a particular supplement like St. John's wort instead of taking an antidepressant, you're just practicing an herbal form of the same type of limited medicine.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. And, and it might work, and that's great, but I'd still encourage everyone listening, just still dive into all those basics and make sure those are right, because that's why things probably got out to begin with.
Right, great. So I think we're done here. Any final thoughts?
No, I mean,
listeners, and then how can those listening contact you, find out about your books, your programs, and how to consult with you?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing and getting out all this great information to people. And for anyone listening, anxiety and depression, it's not easy. I think these are the toughest conditions, because when you've had it and you've gone through it, it feels very insurmountable sometimes. So for those people, I want to say a couple of things. One is, if you're taking drugs, don't just stop taking them, because that's never a good idea, and that can be dangerous. So you always want to continue, but I want to let you know that there are practitioners, there's naturopathic doctors, functional medicine doctors, and they have answers that I think are more holistic and can really help. And so that it's really worth pursuing this kind of thinking. And I do see daily how it can help people. So don't give up, and please do keep working on this, because it's absolutely worth it, and you're absolutely worth it. And as far as contact information, my clinic website is www.innersourcehealth.com. That's INNERSOURCE health.com. Our phone number is 631-421-1848. And and it's just really been such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dr. Bongiorno.
Okay. Have a great day.